Hello, this is Ben here, Dave's assistant. Right now, we're doing the skeins to make a red-black Scagliola, and we're about to lay them down for the veining. The base is lino in plastic, which has been flattened down onto his workbench using lard as a kind of lubricant to really make it lay flat and stick really consistently. So here we have a black pigment liquid that we're soaking these strings in. If you ever remember doing cat's cradle as a child with either a string or a yo-yo, this is kind of like if a cat's cradle went terribly wrong. That's kind of what we try to shoot for when we're making these kind of complex veins. So we soak them in this black pigment, and then we lay them out like so in a kind of, we try to make kind of a natural marbly pattern as we lay them out. Generally, after we soak them in the pigment, we like to pull them apart. They get kind of stuck together, and we like to pull them apart into these tangled kind of messes that we use for the veining. You can see Dave pointing out there that the end of one skein matches up with the beginning of another, so that when the seams meet, there will be a seamless transition between one vein and the next. And so we just go down the entire length. Some of the bigger, thicker veins that are going to be a bit more pronounced and on the bottom and they're easy to grab, we use cotton for. But then the real thin, really hairy kind of complex veining, we'll use silk skeins for. And there's Dave just pointing out to make sure they line up so that so that the seam isn't very obvious when we wrap it around the column. And so that's all the cotton skeins down, and here are some silk skeins going down, just to get this really complex, beautiful kind of pattern of veining. And you can see we're going around with paper towels, just daubing where the ink has kind of drained out of some of the skeins so that it doesn't affect the rest of the red Scagliola too much. So we're just daubing it, and we're making sure the ends of the skeins are always over the side bools so that they're easy to pull out once the Scagliola is placed on it. So now what you do is, for Mezzo Scagliola, which is what we're doing here, you want to mix your pigmented plaster with glue water so it has a consistency kind of yogurt. You know, if you've ever, had yogurt with strawberry fruit or something on the bottom, and you mix it up and it kind of makes that like slurry, kind of like whirlwindy kind of mix. That's what we go for sometimes. Here we're just using 3 different shades of red for this simple kind of color scheme that we want. Dave's throwing down a dark, and you see how he's kind of throwing it. So you get these natural kind of, patterns. He's using a certain shade, I'm using a different shade. And what we do is we want, like the skeins, we want to line up where the Scagliola of a certain shade touches the edge of the plastic. We want to make it line up with that same shade on the other side. So whenever I put a certain shade on one side, we match it up to the other so that the seam isn't so pronounced once we wrap it around the column core. There's Dave pointing that out to me, that idea that I was just telling you about. Dave's telling me to make sure they match on each side. You can't tell here, but these reds, when they dry, are in fact different shades. They look like they're the same color, but they're not in the end. When they dry, you can tell the difference between the darker and the lighter and the kind of in between. So our goal here is really to, to cover the entire board with our various reds before we build up the back with dry plaster to suck up the moisture and really build it up to 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch or something, depending on what our rules are, our side rules. And there I am, just making sure every little bit gets used. We don't want to waste too much of it. And there you can see Dave mixing up more of the dry mix with glue water. And the reason we use glue water is because plaster of Paris, gypsum plaster, often sets quite quickly. And adding kind of melted hide glue or bookbinding glue or rabbit's glue to the water lets us work with the Scagliola for longer before it hardens. There we are, just kind of filling in the gaps, throwing this yogurty like plaster. And here's Angelique, just come to help us. And we're just filling in the rest here. So those little gaps need all be filled. You can see me scooting around there. You want to generally work as fast as possible while still being careful. So that's why we're kind of have a controlled quickness to our actions here as we try to complete this. You can see Dave using a credit card or a card from some business or another to gently pull the Scagliola into places where it's not, and have a consistent kind of thickness and coverage. We really want to make sure there's no holes whatsoever by the end of this stage. So at this point, we are ready to take out the skeins. We want to make sure, when possible, to take the skeins out in the reverse order that we placed them, so that the tops, because if we take out the bottom skein first, it'll drag other skeins through parts we don't want it dragged through just yet. And so we take them out in a particular order, and then we mix the liquidy pigment from that the skeins were soaked in, that black, and we mix it with some of the excess Scagliola from when we were tossing it. And then Dave's just going to mix those together to make like a darker red. It's actually much blacker than it looks until it dries, but he's going to use that to fill in the gaps where we pulled the pigment through the Scagliola via the skeins. And there's me and Angelique just very carefully making sure these skeins come out cleanly. And there, Dave has just told me to make sure that the edges are straight, and we want to make sure that there's no Scagliola on the rules, and that we use as much as we can. And there's Dave just leveling that darker black-like red into where the gaps are, where we pulled out the veins. We would have pulled out the skeins so that the veins stick out even more in the end product. And there's me just checking the camera. Angelique is outside using the excess Scagliola to mix with the black pigment to make more fill. So now we want to really increase the thickness of the Scagliola and get it to kind of start setting, so in a way. So we start dusting on dry mix onto the back, and that'll soak up all this sweating that the Scagliola is doing. It keeps producing moisture from the mixes, and we want to suck that moisture out and thicken the entire backing, so that it all equals out to our rules and it's all the same consistent thickness. Now, after all that, what we want to do is level off the top. So me and David are using this ruler kind of rule that he's created here, and we're just using it to skim the top very carefully to make sure that it's got a consistent thickness and that it's flat. And you can see we're just kind of jiggling it to make sure that we don't tear any up as we're going along. And so now, to make sure that the Scagliola sheet sticks really well to the column, we're going to move the lathe over in preparation for pressing it on, and Angelique is going to apply a kind of wet slurry to the back. And wetting the column core like that, putting wet Scagliola on, will make it so that the sheet easily adheres to it and sticks well, so that it all dries together. And here we are just taking the rules off and getting ready to start adhering it. This technique we're gonna use here to put it on the column is a kind of horizontal 45-degree kind of like a slow pressing on horizontally. You could also do it vertically, but this is quite a large column. And so now we've got the board up on the kind of scaffolding that Dave's created, and we're getting it ready to slide the plastic sheet down onto the column. We're going to kind of curve it underneath, and Dave's going to crawl under and use his special curve tool to fit it to the column core. And so here me and Angelique are lowering it down. Often, somebody will spray the core a little bit, just keep it wet. And you can't really see Dave right now, but he's under there with his tool, pressing it onto the core as we slowly rotate the column and slide the sheet down onto it. And here we are just checking to make sure it's consistent, being very careful as Dave presses the lino and the plastic onto the core. And there, Angelique is just checking to make sure it's all going okay. Dave's under there hard at work, making sure he really presses it on firmly. And finally, the rest of it kind of flops down there, and the seam is trying to connect. So now we're making sure it stays wrapped as Dave finishes applying it. So now we can move the board back onto the table while Dave finishes pressing up the lino. And he pulls that back, and now there's that plasticky wool stuff underneath. You can use anything really as long as you can flatten it out. And Angelique's just giving it a check there, and it looks good. And then finally, we're doing some touch-ups here after, where you've put a piece of clear plastic down, and Dave is just continuing to put pressure on it to make sure it's a consistent diameter, or sorry, a consistent radius. You can see that black veining coming through there quite nicely. You see Dave just continuing to touch it up. This whole thing is a very long process. Afterwards, when this is dry, what you do is you want to sand it down with a low grit, something really heavy. Sand it down a lot, and then fill the holes with creamy kind of plaster. Fill all the cracks and holes, and then let that dry, and then sand it down with a finer grit, and you keep doing that over and over until you get this nice polished marble, as you see here. That really gives you something quite gorgeous and finished nicely, polished and buffed to perfection. Thank you, everyone.